Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're almost ready to go and start. I can see that we are at about 106 participants, and so should we get going, panel?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining SAMS for a webinar today. Let me just share the screen and start off a short presentation that will. Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. So. We're going to spend the first hour on our interaction with the panel. It's a 1.5 hour program, and we are going to, our webinar is on not-for-profit organizations in India as great places to work, as already explained to you. Let me spend a few minutes to introduce the webinar in terms of a concept, and then we'd open the floor to our panel for various discussions. Our discussions will carry on till 5 p.m. Unless there's a short overrun, subsequent to which we'd open the floor for questions and answers from the audience. And in the meantime, of course, during our panel discussions, whatever questions come to your mind, do share them in the Q&A box, which is visible at the bottom of your screen. As a quick introduction, and firstly, let me just share the structure of the next 10 minutes with me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background to this webinar, why we decided to conduct this. Also about a survey that we did to feed into the webinar topic. Thereafter have panel discussions. I have a rich panel of 7 development sector professionals who will be joining me. And once we are through with our discussions, as mentioned, we would open up to questions and answers from the audience. We hope to close by 5:30 p.m. A little bit about why this webinar. As some of you know, SAMS turned 25 a few weeks ago. This was on September 25th. And being a 25th year, we thought that this is something that we would like to do. As you all know, SAMS is a for-profit consultancy, but we have been working for the social sector now, and for a very long time, for practically in this entire period of 25 years. Our first few assignments were with the social sector for organizations like WHO, UNFPA, UNICEF, and DFID. And as a consequence of this, we decided that this is a space that we enjoyed working with, and this is what we want to do. And we therefore continue to work with the not-for-profit sector then. So we have effectively been working with non-profit organizations now since 1997. SAMS focuses on areas like recruitment, third-party payrolling. We also work closely in the procurement and supply chain management area. And having done well and thrived in these areas for the last 23 years, we thought that to commemorate our 25th anniversary is to pay back the sector. So what we decided is to reach out to a number of senior development professionals who we have worked with closely over the last 2.5 decades, and ask them what it would take to make not-for-profit organizations in India great places to work. We thought that this was important because NPOs, as you know, do great work, and they need the best talent in the country to do so. And to ensure that they're able to attract the best talent, they actually need to become great places to work. And that's the important need as far as the sector is concerned. However, as recruiters for the social sector now for the last 20 years and more, we recognize that becoming great places to work is still an aspiration for many of the organizations in the sector. And many of them have still many miles to go before they get there. So as we all know that there is a gap between what not-for-profit organizations need to do to become great places to work and the reality. And this needs to be closed for the good of the sector and in fact, for the country as well. So, which is why we decided to work on this topic. We've assembled some of the smartest senior development practitioners I know and requested them to help in developing solutions to address these gaps. To feed into the panel and provide them with perspective for them to work on, we thought it would be good to also do a small survey. And so what we did was to reach out to more than 60 development professionals that we knew well. These were a cross-section of professionals who worked as board members with the sector, CEOs. We also worked with functional heads and HR heads. So we assembled about 60 such development sector professionals and requested them to fill up a short survey for us, soliciting feedback from them on the quality of leadership of their organizations, the quality of management practices, their culture, feedback on HR practices. And we also asked them to identify to their mind what were the key challenges of the sector, what were the key challenges faced by not-for-profit organizations, as well as on a freewheeling basis to suggest solutions. This was an important input to the panel. We received more than 300 qualitative responses covering both challenges faced by NPOs and suggested solutions. Some of these solutions predominantly were in HR. About 28% of our responses came in that zone. We also got a very large response on resource mobilization and sustainability. About 16% of our responses were in that area. We also got a large number of responses in leadership, about 11%, a large number of responses again in systems and processes, about 9%. And this gives you a sense of what the survey taught us, or the input it gave us for the panel. We got feedback on broadly the following areas: leadership, on management, on culture, on HR. So there were 4 broad areas in which we got input from the 60 odd professionals that we reached out to. And as you can see, we quizzed them on almost about 14 different attributes. These are the scores that the respondents gave us. So, just to make it easier to understand, we've also graded them. So broadly, if you look at parameters or attributes that we have got feedback in the area of in the area of leadership, which would include attributes like: is the leadership team ethical? Is the leadership team competent? Can the leadership team be trusted? Now, the responses that we got, 72% of the respondents said yes, the leadership team is ethical. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is how you interpret them. 72% of our respondents thought that the leadership team was ethical. 59% thought it was competent. 55% thought it was trusted. So broadly, what we did on the basis of these scores and the grades that we gave them, with a 72% response, we gave a grade of A, pretty much as we would for any kind of a performance appraisal system. So a score of a competency which got a score of 59% gets a grade of C, and so on and so forth. So using this as a framework, what our survey told us is that in the area of leadership, our respondents thought that not-for-profits actually got a B grade. In the area of management, they got a C grade. In the area of culture, they received a C grade again. And in the case of HR, it included things like ability to pay well, appraisals, and so on. Some of the softer aspects of HR and management of not-for-profits, the score was even lower. So the average score that our respondents gave to not-for-profits in that particular area was as low as a D. So this gave us some inputs. Let me display this again in the form of a chart so that it's easier to understand. These are the scores broadly in leadership, management, culture, HR. So it gives us a sense that in Leadership, for example, we're doing well by and large. If you look at the scores obtained, as high as 72% in ethicality, scope for improvement in competence, and fostering trust and respect. In the area of management, again, middling scores, broadly transparent. Again, we're following consensual management practices. In the area of culture, there seems to be broad middling scores again, with the respondents scoring these organizations in the region of about 50%. What got a high score was brand value and the respect that organizations got. And again, in the area of HR, as we mentioned before, the scores were low. Our panel survey fed and suggested the following areas for our survey. Our survey suggested the following areas for our panel. Broadly, what were changes in the area of high-level changes or at the strategic level? What were the changes required to enable that to happen in management and systems and processes and resource mobilization? And again, what were the organizational changes that needed to be made to drive this? So we're going to be working on these panel discussion areas in a few minutes. And also, as mentioned earlier, we would be fielding question and answers that come to your mind during these sessions. You could input them into the Q&A box and we'll take them up later. And of course, if you're unable to answer any questions, we'll get back to you by email as we have your email IDs. Let me quickly identify and introduce the panelists in the sequence in which they'd be taking various panel discussion sessions. Dr. Raju, who is the ex-director at ActionAid. He was heading organizational effectiveness at ActionAid as well as the Leprosy Mission Trust. Mr. Matthew Cherian, who is presently the Global Ambassador for Aging at HelpAge India and earlier the CEO. Vinoj Manning, who heads IPAS as the CEO. He heads IPAS Development Foundation, and Vinoj heads an organization which has consistently been winning within the not-for-profit sector, the Great Place to Work now for the last more than 3 to 4 years. Mr. Shankar Venkateshwaran, who is a senior development specialist, and for the last many years, for the last 3 decades, he's been working with not-for-profits and is today a board member on many not-for-profit organizations as well as corporate foundations. Mr. Gurumani, who's working in a very similar capacity. He's an independent director and advisor on a large number of non-profit boards. Sapna, who is an HR director with Care India. She has been working as the head of HR now for many years, for more than a decade. Jyoti Puri, who heads HR at IPAS Development Foundation. Jyoti has also been working in the HR space now for many years. And as mentioned before, IPAS has been winning the Great Place to Work, a very high rank in that survey on an annual basis now for the last 4 years. And of course, there's me. Having introduced the panelists, let me launch into the very first panel discussion. So our first panel discussion is on the high-level and strategic changes that are needed by the not-for-profit sector. And here we would be discussing the following subjects. We would be talking about the need for high-level change in the area of governance, followed by leadership, and also in the area of the government and regulatory framework. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Raju. And Dr. Raju is going to be spending the next few minutes telling us about the needed changes in the area of governance. And let me set the ball rolling by asking Dr. Raju. Dr. Raju, clearly the governing body or the governing board in not-for-profit organizations, that's an area that needs to see a lot of change, improved governance when it comes to the governing body, and to ensure that they work independently, that they're not influenced by founders, as well as long-term members of the governing board. I'd be grateful for your thoughts on how that can be handled. If Dr. Raju would shed some light on this topic, please.
Okay. Thank you, Gautam, and I appreciate that you have had me on the panel today, just to share a few thoughts. On the question of governance in the not-for-profits, for me, governance is singularly the most significant aspect in terms of making an organization a great organization or take it down the tube. And this is true for all organizations, and I think all the more true for not-for-profit organizations. I think to understand this, we have to go back into some of the history of the not-for-profit, because most of these not-for-profit organizations have been founded by people with a great passion to do something good for the society. So they had a call. So they wanted to make a change in the society. That's why these organizations were founded and started. And as they grew, these founders also became part of the organization. Some of them worked as operating people in the organization, and some of their friends also joined. So as this organization grew, and they got very emotionally attached to the organizations. And it came to a point now when the organization has become large, now they have to let go things. Now, when they have to let go things become very difficult because they are so closely, passionately attached to the cause and the organization. Something like a parent-child relationship, whether even if you're a 60-year-old child of your parents, you're still considered and treated like a 6-year-old. I think most of you would experience this, and as much as I do. So what is important is that the founders and others get so emotionally attached. When the organization grows, they can't let it go. They care for the organization so much, but their whole process actually restricts the growth of the organization. So what is the way out of this? And having been in a couple of organizations, one of the things that I see is that we need to have a process, need to have an instrument to make some of this happen. And one of that for me is that to build a vision in terms of the role for the organization of the governing board. So the governing board is a visionary. Governing board looks at their strategy. Governing board looks at the values. Governing board looks at in terms of how to take the organization to realize its purpose. So one thing which kind of comes to me is that to have a good governance manual, what we call it. Now, governance manual for me, I mean, we look at it broadly into 4 segments. The first segment is actually to define what is the visionary role of the governing board itself. The second aspect is what should be the kind of a board membership? What should be the kind of competencies? What kind of values frame the board members should bring in? The third is the board development, a very difficult thing to do because just like you and me who work in organizations, board members also need development. Board members also need capacity development. Board members also need sensitization. So the third dimension is the board development. The fourth dimension is board accountability. Now, boards, just like you and me who work in organizations, are also accountable for the strategic outcomes of an organization. So there are 4 important aspects in terms of a board governance, which is growth oriented, not in terms of interfering with the management, in terms of the working. So if we can work on these 4 dimensions through a tool called the Board Governance Manual, it's not an easy thing to do. Okay, it's quite a challenging thing. But if we can work on this, I think we will make a lot of headway in terms of getting good governance into the not-for-profit organization. Gautam.
Okay. Shankar, is that something which seems to be viable, having governance tools?
Yeah, no, I think Raju's absolutely right, and all those 4 points are extremely valid. So I can't agree with them more. I think the important aspect I have found is that the transition that has to happen in a founder-led organization, that's the hardest one. And all of these manuals and processes that Raju talked about, for that to happen, the founder has to believe in it, because as he said, he or she has to let go. So to
Right.
me, that's the important aspect. And I think that's one part of a conversation that I found sometimes doesn't happen very effectively. A conversation between the board and the founders and saying, look, let's agree on our roles and let's not, step on each other's toes. So it's about also agreeing to something, which then finds its way into a manual. So I think that's also an important part of the process.
Right. Thank you. So,
Just one point to what Shankar said. I think two things are important. One is the humility of the founder and the courage to actually to be part of the process. Thank you.
right. So that's extremely interesting, Dr. Raju. And what happens? Perhaps we'll also be talking about the flip side, which is that when board members get empowered and then they transcend the governance role and start actually managing the organization. Is that something that you'd like to talk about as well?
They do at times, because I think they do because not they have any wrong intention, they have good intention, but they don't know what the outcomes of that good intention is. And in that process, the leadership gets stifled. So one way of separating that is in the manual itself, defining what the roles of the board and what the boards of management, the management role is, and how they will interfere. This is possible, it can be done.
Right. And would either of Matthew or Guru have anything further to say on governance in this particular area, which is getting the board to work cohesively with the organization and to play the role that is envisaged for them?
I have something to say, because much as Shankar said, and Raju also said about governance manual, when we set up the Credibility Alliance for Good Governance and Transparency, we found that the big problem in the voluntary sector was a bit like what happens in political parties and in corporate sector, that there were quite a few relatives of the founder on the board. And there was also a conflict of interest, especially family members running the show. So this is true not only with the urban NGOs, with the thing. And it's difficult to keep the interest or the related party interest of the members in the governance. So it's a big haul. And many people said in rural areas, our wife and our son-in-law are the most competent people, and that's why we have put them on the board. But later on, it leads to literally a one-man show or a one-woman show. So governance is just reduced to a simple operation of the family. So this is something which we need to take care of in the voluntary sector. Much as we may criticize the political sector, this happens in the voluntary sector as well. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Guru, you need to put your voice.
Okay. I just wanted to add something to what Mr. Matthew said. You know, one of the biggest problems, especially when you are dealing with senior people and people with a lot of accomplishments, is the management of egos. So when boards need to come together and work together as a cohesive unit, the egos of the members do come in the way, you know, in the sense that they have their own pride in their past achievements and they have their own interests. And to get them to talk and come to an agreement in short board meetings is not very easy. So that's the second challenge, which is a very important hurdle in making governance effective in organizations.
Thank you so much, everybody. I think if with Dr. Raju's permission, can we move on to the next section?
Yes, Gautam. Thank you.
Okay. So this would be a section which I'd urge Matthew to help us and guide us further. And it would be in another area which obviously needs a lot of resolution and effort. This would be in the leadership space. And how do you get the leadership team to buy into and adopt best practices? This is something which clearly not-for-profits struggle with, largely because of historical practices and inertia which kicks in, and also the usual argument which is put forward by most non-profits, which is we can't afford to adopt best practices. I mean, that's okay for corporate sector, but not for not-for-profit organizations. So can Matthew guide us in this area, please?
Actually, most of the senior management leadership in voluntary sector is all usually homegrown. Many of them have spent many years in the organization and built up over a period of time. And they like to adopt new practices, but there is an inertia, as you said, to adopt them. So one of the ways that I had done it is to introduce ERP system into HelpAge, so that we could break down all the processes that we do, so that we have then automated processes to look at it. And it also ensures transparency, that everybody across the organization can see the processes going, and if an approval is stuck at any stage, they know where it is going. And this has helped us tremendously during COVID, because we had the entire office not working and most people working at home, but the backbone of the ERP was able to continue, and we were able to continue to do whatever we wish to do, and even the last mile delivery was also ensured. There is also another reluctance in the non-profit sector towards trained managers. Suppose you are an MBA from a B school, or you're from a rural management institute. There's a feeling that you are the new kid on the block. What do you know? We have worked for 20 years in this business. And so in many organizations, including Oxfam, where I came in, they said, oh, what is this young upstart going to teach us about management? So there is a resistance, but it has to be overcome. If they find out that you're able to work as good as them or even better than them, then slowly it turns around. So actually it is leadership by example, and then slowly people buy in. And the second area which is to be ensured is the whole transparency in management, in the sense I've always followed an open door policy where anybody could walk in, from a peon to a senior manager could walk in at any point of time and discuss anything pressing. So what the belief went down is, here is a CEO who is willing to listen to you, however stupid my ideas may be. So that gives them a sense of confidence. So this, if the senior management is transparent and not hiding behind umpteen meetings, team meetings, and closed door meetings, then people think they're up to something not so good. So there is an effort to ensure transparency, especially in the voluntary sector. So these are some ideas where you can ensure such things happen.
Right. Thank you so much, Matthew. Shankar, anything that you'd like to share based on your own experience at different organizations that you headed? How important is it for the leader, as Matthew said, to set the tone, to lead by example?
Oh, absolutely, no question. That is the key, and I completely agree with Matthew. I think there's again a difference between different kinds of organizations, and I think we were speaking about, and Matthew also spoke about it in the last section on founder-led organizations versus an Oxfam HelpAge kind, which are not necessarily not classified as founder-led. So I think in the Oxfam HelpAge ActionAid kind of organizations, try. It might be a little easier to make that transition. I think in founder-led organizations, it is very difficult. But then the founder is absolutely the key. If the founder believes that this is important, it will happen. If the founder believes that this is not going to happen, it doesn't happen. So what I'm saying is the leadership is, the tone from the top is absolutely critical. More critical in founder-led organizations where the founder is still active and there. Less critical, relatively speaking, in others, but critical without a question. And it's about an attitude, right? And I think, again, you alluded to that. It's about open door saying that you're willing to learn. It is good for everyone to learn. So it is about transmitting that belief that learning is good for everyone. And so let's come up with ideas. Let's innovate. Let's change. Let's get better. So having not only saying it but walking the talk, the leader has to absolutely play that.
Right. Thank you, Shankar. I know Vinod is going to be coming up next in any case, but does Vinod have anything to talk about here? Largely in terms of the usual argument that this is going to be too expensive. It's an experiment which is not going to work, and we'll be burning up money that not-for-profits cannot afford to spend on best practices.
I do think whenever I hear this, and I hear this quite often, that we are not able to invest because our donor grant structures don't allow this, and corporates have reserves. We are not allowed to take it beyond 3 years, so on and so forth. But I do think it's more an issue of intent rather than resources. If we do have the intent for investing, if we do have the intent to believe this is important, this is very critical, we would find the way out. So the excuse of saying it's, we are different, we are non-corporate, so we won't hold ourselves to high levels of standards or the latest developments in each of these fields, HR, governance, so on and so forth, is, I think, a lame excuse.
Right. Okay. So would Dr. Raju or Guru have anything further to say on this before we move on?
I mean, from my experience of working with not-for-profit, investment in leadership is worth every rupee that we do. And an organization which in one time where I worked for, where we are really going down, we turned around just because we invested in the leadership. And as Matthew and others said, it is the belief of the people who are at the top. Yes, it will work, then it will work. If they feel that it doesn't work, nothing will work.
Absolutely. Okay, so with your permission, could I just move on to the next sub-session, which is back to Matthew. And we've been talking about investments in best practices, and the other investment that needs to be made obviously is also in people, in making sure that the organization is well resourced, which is frequently a challenge again, Vinod, which is that not-for-profits are endemically in a project mode. Their funding is tied to specific work. And so therefore the organization frequently doesn't have the capacity or the intent or the willingness, and neither do donors allow that, for them to be fully resourced. And so you have the big win situation that the only resource, the only part of the organization which is looked as a core function is possibly the accounts, right? And so that is given a lot of financial muscle, but nobody else. And you could frequently have the leadership team has a huge challenge in introducing people management practices, marketing and communication, making requisite people investments there, also in technology as well as knowledge management. So over to Vinod, and if he could share his experiences on this area. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Gautam, again, I think when we are talking about organizations, as it was mentioned earlier by Shankar, there are various grades within the NGO sector. We have founder run organizations, which could be very small, which could be very large. But at least talking about medium-sized to the larger not-for-profit organizations, I really do not think we do have an excuse of saying that we can't afford it or it is not very critical. It's a lack of awareness, a lack of belief that it's, especially we are not in the business of selling soaps. They're not-for-profits. Therefore, our industry especially is so much people focused, and it all dependent on the quality of the HR team right down to the last mile. So all the more reasons NGOs need to be focused on building, investing in HR. And I really like the way you have phrased the question of saying, talking about leadership team. Because my experience has been right from the start of my career has been, it is the team, the top team that sets the ethos, the culture of the organization, and that individual leader alone cannot do much about the organization unless they are in a sync. So when we talk about leadership here, leaders, I do think we will be talking about the overall leadership team, and otherwise it's not going to work. So and again, the point is, you may be a leader, you may believe in a lot of things, but if your immediate supervisees and down the line do not believe that and bring day-to-day practices that reflect that, it's not going to work. Because very simply, as all of us know, why do people leave managers? People quit from managers. People do not quit from companies and not-for-profit organizations. I think the HR research indicates 50 to 80% of the reasons why people quit is to just get away from bosses. All the more, therefore, all the more necessity that organizations invest in the team to make requisite investments to make the team respond. You want every manager, every supervisor to invest in building the team, but that means a culture change. And honestly, a culture interventions need two kinds of interventions. One is at the principal level, and one is at operating processes, standard operating procedures that talk to the principles. For example, in our organization, one of the key values that we have is respect. Basically, it's about respect to everything, but also largely respect to individuals, your supervisors, your peers, and so on and so forth. That's a principal level intervention, building that, talking about that, communicating that. But that alone won't help unless you have process to back it up. So one of the processes that we have is every employee who exits us, even those we sack, go through an exit interview.
Right.
And that is where things like respect, that is where some of the supervisory aspects come up, which then HR uses to feedback both to the senior management and to the respective supervisors.
Okay.
Having said all that, lastly, as it was said earlier, if the leader does not walk the talk, all that I said doesn't matter really.
Thank you so much, Vinod. So this is clearly an area that needs a lot of work. It also needs a lot of skill and dexterity. I think, as you said, not just in the leader, but the leadership team. And and I'm sure we're going to be talking a little bit more about this in the next few sessions as well, especially in the last concluding session that Jyoti is likely to come on. Let me, in the interest of time, just move on to the next sub session, and which is for Shankar, who has kindly consented to talk a little bit about what is clearly something that needs to, that is, right. Okay. Yeah. So if I could request Shankar to guide us in this area, which is specifically on regulatory change arising on account of the FCRA amendments, which have come in very recently. If you could shed some light and share your thoughts on how is this going to play out and roll out? How do you read the tea leaves as far as the FCRA amendments are concerned, Shankar? We've already lived with these changes now for about 3 weeks. Do we see solutions arising? Is it going to be impacting the sector as seriously as the initial apprehensions are? Over to Shankar.
Yeah, so you throw the tough one at me, but okay. So I think I think one of the things that we have to accept is that no government, independent of its color, likes any form of dissent. It's not surprising that the FCRA was enacted during the emergency, and we know what all of us are old enough, at least on the panel, to know what happened during the emergency. So this is part of that game. Okay, it's a game that is about trying to say that let's not allow dissent to go beyond a point. You know, if any party wanted to actually unshackle NGOs, they could have repealed the FCRA in any time between 1976 and 2020. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that this is not going to go away. So let's not wish that it, I mean, we can all wish that it will go away. It's not going to go away. FCRA is here to stay, and it's over time it's going to get tighter. That's the reality. But I think there's an opportunity there, and I think that's what we should be speaking about. Let's speak about. Let me just stick to two bits of the recent amendments, which are of concern to most people. One is the one on granting, or not allowing on granting, and the second is the limit on admin expenses, right, which is reduced from 50% to 20%. Mind you, the original FCRA, there wasn't any limit. Then the earlier government brought it on to 50%. Now it's down to 20%. So these are the two big ones that I think we need to talk about. So on the first, the on-granting issue. The on-granting issue is the one that actually really impacts agencies like Oxfam, on whose board I happen to serve, or ActionAid, where I worked and whose board I've served, and so on and so forth. Because these organizations are designed to raise money from India and overseas and fund NGOs and help them through that whole process. Now, obviously, if you can't do on-granting, that whole model has to change. And the only way that model can change is that all this funding, instead of it coming through an Indian entity, will have to come from an overseas entity directly. So this affects essentially this category of NGOs, but it's significant because obviously there's a huge role that these organizations play in enabling the smaller organizations, because smaller organizations don't have to go to the trouble of being able to write proposals, complex proposals that meet a donor's requirements, and the ActionAid and the Oxfams and the SAVES of this world make it easier for them to do that. So it's going to affect them, but the knockdown effect will obviously be on the grassroots organizations, and they will now have to learn how to write proposals to the large organizations overseas, so that there's no on-granting issue, that on-granting issue gets solved. So there's a capacity building agenda that is very clear, that more and more organizations that have been receiving funds through the intermediaries will now have to go by themselves. So that's the challenge, and that's where the solution has to lie. The 20% one is an interesting one. The 20% one, again, many of the grassroots organizations so for example, I'm part of a foundation where we on-grant to many organizations. This time when we were doing the grant or the granting exercise, we asked all our partners to do the calculation of the admin expenses, and 95% of them found that they were below the 20%. So it wasn't a problem for many of the grassroots organizations. There are those carve-aways, like if you're in health or if you're in education, you can allow that to happen and so on. Again, I don't think the grassroots organizations are going to directly face a problem in being able to meet the 20% cap. They are going to have to then be able to raise their own funds, both from funding foreign and Indian sources. But to me, the great opportunity, especially for the Oxfams and the ActionAids and the SAVES of this world, is that we have to focus more on local fundraising. That is something that the organizations have invested in the past. Organizations in this regard, but many of the others have not been as successful. I think the need for local fundraising is therefore the opportunity. And I think that presents also a challenge, because there are not that many sources that we know of for local funds. There are these set of foundations that everybody knows, and everybody's going to go on already knocking on their doors. Public fundraising is not something that has happened. There are very few. CRY, of course, is a great example of a successful public fundraising organization. But that's the direction that everybody needs to head. So for grassroots organizations, maintaining the 20%, I don't think it seems to be a problem. However, they will need to build their capacity to raise FCRA funds directly, and they will have to build the capacity to raise local funds. That is the huge challenge for the small organizations. For the Oxfams and the ActionAids, they need to figure out what their business model is. Oxfam, I can say, for example, was already moving out of trying to be a donor into something else. That is part of the current strategy. So I think that has to be the way forward for the other organizations. So that's the challenge, and I think that's where the solutions also seem to lie. But it's not going to go away. I can tell you that. Right. I mean, you were also asking, can we advocate for changes and so on? We of course must advocate, can advocate, should advocate, but will it happen? I'm not going to hold my breath on that.
Okay, so that's so it's clearly going to see a lot of so there's need for rapid change in the sector, but since we've done it in COVID times, perhaps we'll be able to do it here too. So some extremely challenging times ahead for the sector, from what I can make out. Would Matthew want to say a few words here? I know he's worked very extensively in the FCRA domain, and would he have a few thoughts to share as well?
Yeah, the difference between Swadeshi and Videshi has become quite clear now, and with the current crop of leadership at the political level, they increasingly think that anything Videshi is bad, except for their own purposes. So, of course, I have been always telling that we NGOs and the corporate sector should have a level playing field. For example, just like there is ease of doing business, there has to be ease of doing good as well. So this is something which we need to look at. And this 20% rule is going to be a very interesting rule, because I think it will force many organizations to tighten the overheads, to reduce costs, because I don't want to name organizations, but some of the organizations whose boards I have been, unlike Shankar talking about people who are below 20%, these were all above 20%. So they are going to have a hard time. How do we structure ourselves? How do we reduce the cost of leadership? How do we also reduce our overheads in the long run? And at the same time, when we go into public fundraising, the Indian public doesn't like to support huge overheads as well. My experience is, when even a small donor comes to HelpAge, they would like to know what is their CEO salary. They would like to know what is the senior management salary. It is all part of the transparency debate. And I think a ratio between the top management to the lower level of staff should be not exceeding 1:10. So there is a lot of restructuring. Since you guys are the HR experts, there will be a lot of restructuring which needs to be done. This is what I have to say at the moment. I won't go into the critique of the FCRA, which I don't like,
right.
Which is, yeah.
Thank you so much. I can see that we are running a little short on time, so maybe let me move on to the next session or sub-session, and this is, let me pass on the spotlight to Guru, who's going to be now talking about another aspect of change, which is, change which is of an enabling type. So far, we've been talking about change at the leadership and governance level, and also in regulatory changes. What Guru is going to be talking about is changes that are required at the management systems and processes and resource mobilization. So we're now moving into enabling changes. And if Guru can talk about changes that are required in the management space. Guru, over to you.
Thank you, Gautam. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that to become a great place to work is really a marathon. It is not a sprint. So there's a lot of changes that need to happen at the top. But then there is a lot of changes that need to happen at the organizational level. And I would like to think that it really starts, like Dr. Raju said, it really starts at the top. And I think, the best way to do that is to have a very good, strong, cross-functional senior management team. Now, what do I mean when I say a good, strong, cross-functional senior management team? I mean that every function must find a representation in this team. And that is, I think, more easily said than done, because not all functions are headed by people at the same level. And there are some functions that tend to get headed by somebody at the officer level. And it becomes very difficult to figure out, who should be included and who should not be included. And I think one of the rules that we need to follow is good cross-functional representation in the team. And I think in this team, the CEO has to be a part of this team, and he has to lead by example. What do I mean when I say lead by example? I mean that he must really become a very strong advocate of this team, and he must be seen to be a very, very active member of this team. And I would even suggest that you should, and in my experience in the organization that I have worked in, having a board member taking some kind of a mentor relationship for this team is always helpful. And this board member should attend some of these team meetings to observe how the team is actually conducting itself. And when you talk of cross-function, I would also say that this team needs to become more inclusive, and inclusive in the best possible sense, not just in terms of levels. For example, I have seen organizations where all the senior managers are men, but then the organization tends to work on gender-based issues. So it might help to have a senior woman staffer becoming a part of this team, if not for all the meetings, but at least some of the meetings, so that, you get all shades of opinion about the internal culture within the organization, like how women are treated. I remember, for example, that when we were in CARE, we had a serious problem with the kind of toilets that were being given to women. And we didn't get to know about it till, someone came to the meeting once and as a guest member and complained to us. So what I'm saying is that the more inclusive you make this team, the better it is in terms of getting to know the pulse of the organization and helping it move forward. Now, there are some, rules which I have found work very well in terms of how to make this team, make this cross-functional team effective. I think the most important thing is for the CEO to lead by example and to attend all the meetings. The second one I would say is, regularity in the meetings, because I've seen organizations where where there is a senior management team, but it doesn't meet as often as it should. It meets, it meets whenever it can. The third thing is, it has to have a lot of tolerance for diversity and differences, and paying attention to how this team is actually functioning becomes very important, because in most meetings you will find that there are people who don't actually pick up the courage to talk. So the CEO has to take the observe, and he has got to ensure, he or she has to make sure that these people are heard by prompting them to express their opinion. I've already mentioned about board involvement and monitoring. Closure of all the discussions is important, and for that, minutes is a very important tool to do that. Having the minutes, reviewing it at every meeting, and closing out on issues that were raised, I think is very important. Finally, I would say that these kind of cross-functional teams are a great way to instill a coaching and mentoring culture within the organization. And if there is one thing which I think can help an organization become a great place to work, it is really a coaching and mentoring culture. A coaching and mentoring culture can bring out a lot of things to do on a day-to-day basis within the organization. It can help improve communication. It can help improve, day-to-day interactions between bosses and subordinates. And like uh, like Vinod said, people leave not organizations, they leave their bosses. And it can help bosses become better, because when you have a coaching and mentoring culture, starting with the board and coming down to the CEO and coming down to the function heads and coming down to the next level and the next level, one finds that the ripple effect of this and the cascading effect of this throughout the organization will help the organization become truly a great place to work. The last point which I do want to cover is is about how can this process be supported. And I think this support has to really come from the board, because what is decided in board meetings can really find effect at the operating level and at the programmatic level only through actions which are taken both on a day-to-day basis and in the short, medium, and long-term basis at all levels of the organization. So communication from the board and the CEO to all levels of the organization using the team process is, I would say, absolutely mandatory. And the more you instill this process, the more effective the communication is throughout the organization using the team process, the greater the chances that the organization will graduate to be a great place to work in.
So much, Guru.
Gautam, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Guru. And I think I can see that we are running woefully short of time. So perhaps let me move on to Vinod without any further ado, and ask him to perhaps speak briefly on another aspect of enabling change, which would be in the area of systems and processes. Over to you, Vinod.
Yeah, and the systems, processes, why do we have them? We have them primarily for durability of the organization, right? So that something that is good gets carried over and something which is not good gets modified over the process. Before I even talk about this, I wanted to throw some data here. If you look at the list of Fortune 500 companies in 1955 and compare them to the list in 2019, I understand that only 55 of the 500 companies that were there in 1955 still is in the current list. This is pretty startling. Giant companies, greatly funded, probably the best managers, do not have the impetus to survive over 75 years, then what about the rest of the organizations? And in a job that in an NGO sector, which plays very critical role for that small target group that we work in, sustenance is extremely critical. But still very often, we don't really deliberately talk about systems, processes that lead to this kind of durability. We talk a lot about sustainability of our programs, but what about sustainability of the organization? So very quickly, and Gautam, I think from your body language, I think you're stressed about the time. So very quickly, 3-4 things. One is, it's important for NGOs to stay true to the vision. We cannot keep moving to the current flavor or where we think potential funding is available. HelpAge is HelpAge today because of its unwavering focus on working with the age folk. If they start doing other things, they lose the brand equity, they lose the shareholder trust, and more than that, they won't have the internal competencies. But very often, we NGOs tend to go where funding drives us. We need to learn to say no. And for that, we need strategic processes internally. Two is we need to predict future demand for the future. They say that but it's very difficult to do that. For example, if Henry Ford had done a classic market research, which is very often the kind of thing that we do, all that he would have got is his clients would have wanted faster horses. Nobody would have told them that he wants automobiles, right? And when we work in our social sector, it's going to be even that much more difficult to predict the future trends, what will make us. What we have done in addressing that is we have something called a Youth Advisory Council. Our senior management is all 45 plus, and I'm at the top of the other end of the spectrum. There's a realization that probably the world is changing too fast for us to learn secondhand. So can we learn directly from our end staff? So this Youth Advisory Council is below 30. Their whole job is to populate the organization with ideas, trends, and question our strategies. That's one way. There could be multiple ways. But I really think for an NGO, we need to keep learning and learning. How do we listen better? How do we dialogue better with our stakeholders? Because everything else is, I think, periphery. The last is technology is changing a lot. Can we be predictive enough to quickly input it and realize what is going to become obsolete? For example, in our work, we work with adolescents quite a bit. And as their access to mobile technology goes up, we are realizing that chatbots, digital information delivered at their phone on very sensitive, we work on very sensitive issues of SRH, very private messages. So messages that come in and can be self-destruct or the thing. So these are some of the technologies probably we should start investing, because the traditional way of doing our interpersonal communication with these adolescents is no longer going to last. So these are some of the things that we need to do. Lastly, leadership pipeline. You can't have, what are your systems processes to make sure leadership pipeline happens? Every time if somebody goes on a long leave, and if I'm hesitant saying, oh my God, let's say Jyoti is here, Jyoti is going on a 1 month line, then my systems processes are not very effective. So how do we get the leadership pipeline developed? That's broadly it, Gautam.
Thank you so much, Manoj. It's been extremely exciting hearing a lot of your willingness to learn from the younger youth coordinators. That's a brilliant idea, and I think I should I'm listening to you with a great deal of interest and intent, and I hope to try and experiment with this idea myself. Again, in the interest of the limited time now available, can I move on to Matthew? Ask him to talk on the next sub-theme, which is enabling change in the area of resource mobilization. Would Matthew like to say a little bit here?
Yeah, I would like to say that the time for public fundraising is arrived, and we need to actually raise more of Indian money, which means there is need to raise on the internet. There is also need to raise from your own neighbors. Very often the NGOs cannot even explain their programs to their neighbors or to their grandmothers, etc. So they need to actually work out a program by which they can communicate what they're doing in a better way. If you can do this, you can also start raising money, because there is a lot of Indian money available. Of course, the latest estimates is that there is 16 billion worth of Indian money to be raised, and this will have to be raised in the next few years. Maybe the loss of FCRA is a good thing, which is forcing all the NGOs to do it. And last but not least is this whole idea of transparency has to be emphasized. Most NGOs will experience that donors who even give 1,000 rupees will come and ask you for a complete set of accounts, and will ask you for details which you will have to explain. You cannot hide behind saying that you're in a meeting and you're in some other Zoom call so that you cannot attend to them. So you will have to answer these questions, which will mean CEOs will become the big communicators to the donors so that they can understand what is the program and how can they raise it. And we'll have to get onto this. And unless we do this, we will not be able to become sustainable, as Vinod was putting it. Organizations have to become sustainable if they have to pursue with their vision. So the future is now rather than later.
That's interesting and very clear, and it also sounds very grim at this point of time. But perhaps, as both Shankar and you and others have said, this could well be an opportunity, and the time for public funding is possibly now very much on our hands. Thank you so much, Matthew. And I'm going to be moving into the last segment. So it's back to Dr. Raju, who's going to be talking about, how do you actually make all these changes happen at the organizational level. So Dr. Raju is going to be talking about changes at the people level. So Dr. Raju.
Thank you, Gautam. When I came from the corporate sector, the development sector, and when I came in, the first few months were very frustrating. And the question that I have had is that, this is something very simple. Why can't these people understand and do it? As regards my staff and others, my colleagues. And a couple of months down the road, I asked my boss, what is going on? At this rate, I would be very frustrated. I think I made a bad decision of coming to the development sector. Then he told me something. He said, don't expect what you expect in the corporate sector in terms of the skill level of the people who are there with you in the development sector. So it led me to think and understand that what ticks the people in the development sector, the social sector, is something different than what it ticks the people in the corporate world. Now, two things which came to my mind. One was that they may not have great competencies, but they have great commitment. So my challenge was, how do I leverage the commitment to build the competency so they have a great combination of competency and commitment. So this was a great challenge, and I think the one of the reasons that one of the ways that I try to do, at least like what Guru said, in terms of mentoring people, giving them the opportunity to do things, giving them the opportunity to experiment, innovate, and move forward, and that released actually a lot of their own inbuilt strength in terms of bringing it to the organization. So some of these things have worked. So I'm very encouraged to talking to Jyoti and Swapna on how this is being done. So I would now love to take it off to Jyoti to talk about how do we bring in the potential of people into the organization's domain. Okay, Jyoti?
Thank you, Dr. Raju. I think it's less about the strategies and processes that you put in place, and it's more about, if you are able to internalize your workforce to the DNA of the organization, half of your job is already done. When I say internalize, I would, go and take lead by what Vinod was also saying, that if the management has the intent to value your staff, you will, the policies and the processes can be, arranged around that framework. So I think all of it comes with the intent of the management. When we hire anybody who comes to work for a non-profit organization or anywhere else, people come with psychological needs, economical needs, and professional needs. And as an organization, I think it becomes, it's our responsibility, and we are accountable for ensuring that we are able to fulfill these needs. And I think senior managers and managers who are able to maximize the potential and creative ability, as well as talent, are the ones who will have competitive advantage. And those who fail, I think they are the ones who will lose talented people in the organization. So how do you ensure and build job satisfaction or not let people leave? What are the things that you can do? Fundamental would be that you create an enabling environment. And when I say you create an enabling environment in an organization, I would think of, are you giving flexibility to your staff members? Do you have policies around flexi hours, work from home? Do you give different kind of leaves, options to your staff members? Second would also be, are you listening to your staff members? And listening also, you can put different mechanisms in place. For example, at IDF, we have town hall meetings. We do have, a field council, which is like a sounding board to the CEO, which also comprises of, the state teams, so the heads of the state teams, 3 members. So are you actually, giving an opportunity? Like Matthew said, even at IDF, people can call up Vinod anytime. Even he prefers people to call after 8 o'clock. But, you can just open up and speak to him, person who is at the ground level also at any point in time. His number is there, his email is there, you can reach out to him. And do you, build a culture of appreciation within the organization? Means you have a robust reward and recognition program. Do you invest in people? Do you, look after their training and career progression? Do you, these are some of the things that I think HR managers and we as HR leaders need to ensure that these practices are put in place, so that there are high level of job satisfaction, and which is going to directly impact employee productivity, their morale, and of course there will be lesser turnover. So I think these are some of the key fundamental things that we need to keep in mind and drive our systems towards it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Appreciate that. Just to kind of summarize what you said just for a minute, that it is mapping the organization DNA and matching it with the DNA of the people who are engaged with the organization to an enabling environment. Very good. Thank you so much.
Just move on to the question and answers. Can Surabhi take the lead and share all the questions we've got from the audience? So, are there a large number of questions, Surabhi?
Yes, there are quite a few questions.
Okay.
So maybe what I've tried to do, I've placed them in respective buckets to be taken by the panelist. I think we'll try to answer a few of them, and rest of them can be answered later after the session and provided to the audience.
Okay. So I know thank you so much, Surabhi. Something a little radical here. We've possibly had the largest amount of time given to governance and to management. Can we try and field questions which pertain to organizational change at the bottom, so that we're able to allocate a little bit of more time conversely? Let's look at some of the people questions for Dr. Raju.
Yeah, so should I read them out, or
Yes.
is it visible? Okay.
It's visible.
It's visible, but I'm trying to non-profit largely sustain themselves and plant and manage more stringent budgets. Okay, all right. Okay, I think I'll just take one question because
Yes.
of lack of time.
Correct.
The first question was a very standard and very classic question in terms of compensation and compensation of the not-for-profit and vis-a-vis the corporate or the for-profit organization. Now, will they be able to match? I think it's not a good comparison to make, because the way the resources are generated by the two sectors are different. Now, should they be matched? I'm not very sure about it, because as I said, people in the not-for-profit work, they tick differently, though they have great needs. I'm not saying for a minute they don't have financial needs. They do have financial needs. But from my working with them over the years, what motivates them largely is if we are able to take care of the definitely a good part of the financial needs in terms of the current and the future, and give them an environment, you can, to a great extent, compensate for the so-called, what we call the opportunity cost or the wage loss, which they would have got in the competitive sector or the corporate sector. So it is possible to do a balance, but it has to be done very carefully and with a lot of nurturing, mentoring, communication, and actually giving them a path. And when they achieve something, one of the important things which they actually get very excited about is actually recognition that they have actually made a change in the society. And for me, that was the greatest motivator, which I work with my people in the not-for-profits to keep them going. Salary, yes, but salary is not all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's one people question. Can we just scroll up a little bit, Surabhi? Yeah. Can we? There's a question for Mr. Gurumani. Would you be able to feel that, Guru? Which is it's on the cross-functional management team, and whether there would be any merit in limiting board meetings to selective staff.
I think both the questions in some ways relate to the connection between the board and the rest of the organization. And really the CEO and the senior management team are the vehicle for establishing that connection. The first question, whether board meetings should be restricted to some select staff. I don't think there is a question of restricting anything to the select staff. I think it's a good practice to invite staff to, to kind of participate in the board meetings and make a contribution where possible, or sometimes, even as a way of familiarizing people with how the organization is being governed, just to let them know how, deliberations take place. It's a good practice to give that opportunity to staff, not just to the senior management team. The second one is that, I covered that in my presentation, that it is very important for the board to be involved in guiding, coaching the organization through the mechanism of the cross-functional team at the top for changes to cascade down throughout the organization. And yes, so the answer is yes, board members and the senior management team must make a very conscious effort to foster transparency within the entire organization.
Thank you so much, Guru. So can you scroll up to the preceding page? Yes. There's a question for Shankar and possibly also for Matthew if he's still with us, which is about large international organizations and their willingness to fund smaller grassroots organizations. Shankar, can you feel that?
Yeah, sure. So the first one, are large international organizations even willing to fund? I thought I would say that that's what many of them do. That's what many of them are designed for. So I'm not sure which ones the person is referring to, but if you look at the ActionAid and the Oxfams and the Gates Foundation and others, that's what they are. That's what they do to fund grassroots organizations. The challenge is that how the processes are which enable the smaller ones to be able to raise to be able to put proposals into these organizations. And with the FCRA route, that's going to become more complex because if you have, for example, in the American India Foundation where I served, or ActionAid where I served for a long time, the program officer's role was to help the grassroots organization put a proposal together. That role will probably go away with the FCRA. So that makes it complex. So yes, absolutely. The answer to the first one is yes. Is there on the second one, the strategic plan behind the logic? Well, I mean, if you ask me, there's no logic to the FCRA itself. So then everything else in the FCRA, to my mind, sort of defies logic. But the stated sort of intent is that because SBI is the largest state-owned bank, they feel that the government feels that that's the way they can control where the funds are going, to who it is going. They will be able to, from one place, be able to figure that. So it's more a ease of control thing than anything else.
Right.
But if I can just, Gautam, just very quickly just speak to a larger governance point, which which we all know, but I think that we just it might be worth restating for all of us in the sector. See, the thing is that we are accountable to communities. We raise money in the name of communities who we are serving. So our accountability is both to the donor and to the communities. So the role of the board is interesting because on the one hand, you're playing a sort of a fiduciary role, a strategic role, an oversight role, but you're doing it on behalf of whom? You're doing it also on behalf of communities. And I think that's where boards and structures actually, to my mind, are not very good at, is to say, how do I ensure that I am making sure that the organization is accountable to the communities, which is also part of my role. But that's a longer discussion. I don't want to get too much into it, but I just want to remind ourselves we are also accountable. We are principally accountable to our communities that we are serving.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess, as you said, that maybe that's a huge topic by itself and the subject for another webinar. So, but thank you for drawing our attention to that. Do we have the time to take one more question? I can see that if we are able to, Sapna, are you back? Have you been able to fix your audio?
Yeah.
Oh,
I think, am I audible now?
You are, absolutely.
Okay.
You are. Okay. So,
I'm sorry about it.
Okay. So in which case, we can actually let Sapna take the floor. And if you could spend a few minutes talking about the HR governance area, Sapna.
Okay. So 20 years ago, when I stepped into this sector, working in the corporate sector, it was so difficult for me to convince my family and my, kith and kin, everybody, like, this is a conscious decision. And people so skeptical about it, like what the organizations look like, where are you stepping in? Having said that, the last 20 years have been so meaningful because what as an HR professional are we bringing to the organization? And I started with the most important critical in the year 2000. When I joined Leprosy Mission, the most important thing that I really worked as an assignment was to improve the performance management system. And very rightly, Vinod just pointed out, policy, what effect it is making. Given down 20 years now, and apparently so many changes have happened from government sector, from donors. There are so many differences have happened. At the same time, it's very critical to note that its governance has really picked up, and HR fraternity has learned to understand that what is the importance of HR governance in an organization, because we are catering to the needs of talent, we are catering to the needs of donors, we are catering to the needs of government, which is watching us also. And the most critical thing is that we are also registered. Like, the NGOs are either registered by trust or societies or, Section 8 companies. So we are accountable as well and we are auditable as well.
Right.
So if there is a donor, there's a donor audit that's happening. If there is a government project, there's a government audit that's happening, and so on and so forth. I think there's a huge need of change of perception. And over the years, HR practitioners, or I would say organizations, like NGO organizations, have really worked hard towards it, staging this. And there is a sense of inclusion of internal and external people. And also there are so mandatory acts that we need to comply with. Compliance is a huge area which many organizations do not even think about it. But I think given the kind of donors that are working in, pulling the money into the organization, it's very, very critical that we have these mandates in place, the compliance is in place, and the board is accountable at the end of the day, and the management is accountable at the end of the day. So having said that, I think few which Jyoti has also touched base is about having, how do we bring that employee component, and for us, are we being seen as the employer of choice? Are people getting attracted to us to work in our organizations? Are we providing an environment where it is enabling and empowering? How is the efficiency and productivity being increased? How to lower our attrition rate? Are we having engaged employee, and so on and so forth? Are we really catering to donor delight? Is the donor really wanting to just give a one-time piece, or recurring pieces of donations? So there are so many things that is going to impact. And the most critical bit is that are we really building employee ambassadors? People come, and are we really giving them the employee experience? Are they leaving us as an ambassador to the organization? And I think this is really happening over the years. I'm really feeling so excited to share today to this forum that yes, there's a set of organizations which have moved towards that. There is no difference, I would say, between the corporate and the not-for-profit organizations. I think there are a lot of things that have really grown over the years. Lot investments have been done in people management, and there is a lot of control and accountability that has set into place. And with this, I will just over to you, Gautam.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to listen to you. This is terrific. Thank you so much, Sapna. And I think in the interest of time, we possibly should, we've already overshot by a short while now. And I can see that we're losing some of our audience. Panel, do we take some more questions, please suggest? Or should we back to our, we can also email our responses to the audience. Please suggest any suggestions from Shankar and Guru?
I think we can continue for another 5 minutes for sure.
Okay.
And then see how it goes.
All right. So with your permission then, panel, let's give it another 5 minutes. Surabhi, can you please put on the questions again? Could you share the questions? Yes. If you could just go right to the beginning, to the very first question. I think there's an interesting question I noted, which is coming from Sunil Gulati. I'm not too sure whether he's still part of the audience or not. But the second question, which is there under governance, are there a few examples of NPOs that are great places to work of different sizes and with different structures? I'm equally curious, can Vinod or Jyoti answer this question? Are there small not-for-profits who are making it, who are getting ranked as well?
Jyoti, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so this is about the Great Place to Work ranking. So there is a set criteria that you need to be at least an organization with a staff strength of 100 people. And I think about 2 years back or a year back, they also introduced smaller organizations who are of a strength of 50. So when we 4 or 5 years back, when we actually partnered with them, we were already 100 plus. So that was their, their benchmark, that 100 staff organizations can participate in the Great Place to Work survey certification program. The characteristics that stand out again is, how the non-profit organizations are building a camaraderie within their own organization. So, they evaluate your HR practices and your policies that you have in place, and also, they conduct a survey within the organization. I think as what has been unique to IDF again is that, again, I would go back to what I was saying, the intent of the organization and the leadership primarily, wherein, you are creating a culture which is strong enough to, not leave your leader or your the organization, the turnover rate or the attrition rates at IDF has been very, very low. So the HR practices, so one is that we talk about so many things about putting our practices and introducing new things and policies and processes, but are you also monitoring your systems or your practices? Are there mechanisms put in place where you are able to get feedback from your employees? So we annually, for example, do an annual climate survey, which is sort of a report card for IDF, where we go ahead and do a dipstick check on our policies and staff morale. How are people feeling within the organization? And the Great Place to Work is another survey, and Vinod has already talked about the exit interviews, which also is like we take that up very seriously. One of my job is to ensure that feedback received from the exit interviews is collated and then shared wherever it is required to with the managers. So
Okay.
those are some of the practices that we introduce that helps us to ensure that people feel connected and engaged within the organization.
So I think that's as much time as we possibly have. Shankar, should we go on one more, or should we?
I think the questions are for the others. So if they are willing to stay, we still have, I think, 123 participants online. So
Okay.
Questions are for the others, and they are willing to, in the panel, and they are willing to stay. Why not?
Okay. So we could then, in that case, let's take one more question. And there are quite a few very interesting questions. So back to Dr. Raju, which is, there are gender balance in the board, and perhaps not just necessarily Dr. Raju. I can see Shankar is possibly equally, perhaps qualified to, or perhaps better qualified than most of us to comment. Is that happening? Is gender balance on the board something which is an aspirational expectation that is likely to see happen? Likely for us to see happen?
At least a few organizations that I'm associated with, it is a very conscious decision and a conscious policy. Not just because you need to have gender balance, but because the organization would like to have different perspectives and different people from different genders. When I say genders, it is not just male, female, we have transgenders. We have a whole range of people who can bring in very quality-oriented input to the organization in its work. And especially if it's a grassroots level based organization, I think bringing in gender very consciously into the organization is a very good thing. And some of them are definitely consciously doing it.
Thank you, Dr. Raju. So I think I'd like to now just propose a word of thanks. This would be from SAMS to all the panelists. Thank you so much for your time and your support. And I must single out Jyoti, who has been truly remarkable, because her family, her husband has been down with COVID, and so have her children. But she still, showed up and supported us for the last 2 hours. Shankar?
I was just giving a thumbs up to Jyoti, that's all.
Oh, okay. So, so thank you so much. I know Matthew has had to run on, so he's not going to make it here for the closing photograph that we're probably going to be having at our end. But thank you so much, each and every one of you, and of course our remarkable audience, for having stayed with us despite the usual mismanagement of time. I must learn to look at the timer more carefully. So thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you so much, Dr. Raju. Also, Sapna, and of course, Vinod and Guru, who have been tremendously, they've made some extremely interesting observations in areas which are of very strong relevance to our subject today. I take this opportunity to thank our audience for also writing in so many questions. Given the paucity of time and not being able to field all of them, what we will do instead is to respond to you. We have your email IDs, and we would solicit responses from our panelists and get back to you within a reasonable period of time. We would also be putting up this whole program after our audiovisual team has managed to edit the proceedings. We'll put it up on our website and also send you a link so that it would be available on the SAM's site, but we will send you a specific link in case we put it up on other social media as well. So thank you one and all for all the time and all your support, and for all the wisdom on this exciting subject, which has been obviously of very strong relevance to all of us.